He painted the changing moods of nature as if they were emotions themselves. Winter with its pale silence, spring with its tentative hope, and summer with its golden laughter. But of all the seasons, summer was his favorite. There was something about its light that made him feel alive. America's most beloved painter often spoke about the beauty of simple things: children running through fields, fathers reading newspapers on porches, mothers baking pies in warm kitchens. But behind those wholesome scenes was a man carrying a secret that could have ended everything he had built. Norman Rockwell, the painter of America's innocence, once created an image that exposed a truth so raw that it made grown men cry and mothers turn away in discomfort. The year was 1964, and the painting, stark and unflinching, forced the country to confront what it didn't want to see. Gallery owners refused to hang it. Newspapers refused to print it. Yet Rockwell painted it anyway, knowing that one brushstroke could destroy the legacy he had spent decades crafting. That defiant moment revealed the real Norman Rockwell, an artist torn between the comforting lie of perfection and the piercing truth of humanity. Norman Pierceval Rockwell was born on February 3, 1894, in a small apartment at 789 St. Nicholas Avenue in Harlem, New York City. His parents, Jarvis and Nancy Rockwell, were quiet, practical people who carried the weight of everyday worries with grace. Jarvis worked for a textile company in Philadelphia and held that same modest position his entire life. The family was never rich, but they survived comfortably enough. Norman had an older brother, also named Jarvis, though the two boys were never especially close. Their house was small, filled with the faint smell of old paper and lamp oil, and divided by small differences. His father was Presbyterian, his mother Episcopalian. Their mixed-faith home often brought gentle arguments about church attendance and prayer, but love, however quiet, always hovered in the background. The Rockwell family line stretched far back into American history. Long before Norman's birth, their ancestors had crossed the Atlantic from England in 1635 on a ship called the Hopewell. John Rockwell, one of the early settlers, helped found Connecticut. That legacy of determination and quiet endurance ran deep in Norman's blood. Even as a boy, he was unlike the others around him. At the age of 3, in 1897, he would sit silently in the living room, his small body barely balanced on the edge of a chair, listening as his father read aloud from Charles Dickens. It wasn't just the stories that fascinated him. It was how Dickens made people reel through words. His father often copied illustrations from books, and Norman would watch, spellbound, as lines and shadows turned into faces and scenes. Something stirred inside him then, a spark that would never fade. His mother's father had been an artist too, though a struggling one who painted gentle landscapes that rarely sold. Still, that spark had passed through generations, waiting for Norman to inherit it. Their home was not filled with luxury, but with imagination. The walls seemed to whisper with the stories his father read and the drawings his mother encouraged. Those early years shaped him in ways no one could have predicted. By the time Norman turned 9 in 1903, he already felt like an outsider. He was thin, awkward, and clumsy, the kind of boy who always seemed to trip over his own shoes. At school, he never quite fit in. He didn't excel in sports or conversation, and even within his family he often felt invisible. Drawing became his escape. It was the one world where everything made sense, where he could control the chaos of life with the simple press of a pencil. He spent hours sketching faces, hands, animals, anything that caught his eye. He exaggerated features, added humor, and used art to cope with the loneliness that followed him everywhere. That same year, his family moved from the noise of New York City to Mamaroneck, a quiet town in Westchester County. The move changed everything. For the first time, Norman saw open skies, green fields, and the calm rhythm of small-town life. He began to fall in love with what he would later call the essence of America, ordinary people doing ordinary things with quiet dignity. He discovered the works of Howard Pyle, one of the most admired illustrators of the day. Pyle's adventurous drawings of pirates, soldiers, and knights ignited Norman's imagination. He saved every penny he could to buy pencils, paper, and paints, And though his family had little money, his mother supported his dream with gentle persistence. Their home was strict and religious, but within that discipline Norman found focus. He studied faces on the street, watched the way people smiled or frowned, and captured those fleeting moments in his sketchbook. The blend of city life and small-town charm etched itself into his soul and would later define his art. By 1908, at just 14 years old, Norman made a decision that would set the course for his life. He left high school and enrolled at the Chase School of Fine and Applied Art in New York City. Each day he took the train back and forth from Mamaroneck, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, his heart filled with determination. His family couldn't afford luxuries, but they believed in his talent enough to sacrifice for it. At the Chase School, Norman studied life drawing, learning to capture the human body in motion. For a boy raised under strict moral rules, the experience of drawing nude models was a shock, but he approached it with respect and focus. He wasn't chasing scandal, he was chasing understanding. In 1910, he transferred to the National Academy of Design, and not long after, to the Art Students League of New York, one of the most respected institutions in the country. There, he studied under legendary teachers, Thomas Fogarty, George Bridgman, and Frank Dumont. Each one shaped a different part of him. Fogarty taught him that every painting should tell a story, that the smallest gesture could carry an entire world of meaning. Bridgman taught him to understand anatomy, to make people feel real, not idealized. Under their guidance, Norman realized that his true gift wasn't in abstract art or lofty symbolism. It was an illustration, in painting stories that made people feel something. In 1912, at just 18, Norman got his first real break. Fogarty helped him land a commission to illustrate 12 Tell Me Why stories by Carl Claudy. He earned $150 for the job, a small fortune for a boy his age. It wasn't just about the money. It was the validation he needed. His work caught the eye of Edward Cave, who was building a new magazine for young readers called Boy's Life. Norman walked into Cave's office with hope shining in his eyes. Cave saw potential in him and gave him a chance. Norman began illustrating scenes for the magazine's camping guides, soon producing more than 400 illustrations. The Boy Scouts of America embraced his art, and through his pen, the image of the perfect American boy was born. Courageous, clean, honest, and full of adventure. By 1913, Norman, now 19, had become the full-time art editor of Boy's Life, an astonishing achievement for someone so young. He poured himself into the work, creating scenes that captured the optimism of youth. His illustrations made the Scouts seem larger than life, their uniforms immaculate, their smiles genuine. His art was so popular that by 1929, the Boy Scout calendar had become one of the best-selling calendars in America. But success never made Norman arrogant. It made him careful. He knew how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could vanish. In 1914, he met another artist, Clyde Forsyth, who would become one of his closest friends. Both men worked for Boy's Life, and they soon rented an old barn in New Rochelle that had once belonged to the legendary Western artist Frederick Remington. The space felt sacred, as if the ghosts of Remington's cowboys still lingered in the wooden beams. Forsyth challenged Norman to aim higher, to submit his work to the Saturday Evening Post, the most prestigious magazine in the country. Together, they spent long days painting and longer nights talking about art and ambition. Forsyth's encouragement changed Norman's life. By 1915, Norman convinced his family to move to New Rochelle, a town filled with illustrators and creative minds. Artists like Joseph Leyendecker, one of Rockwell's idols, lived there. Surrounded by talent and competition, Norman pushed himself harder than ever. Then, in 1916, when he was just 22, everything changed. He submitted his first cover to the Saturday Evening Post. When it was published in May, it was an instant success. Within 8 months, he had painted 6 covers for the magazine. His name was suddenly everywhere. Life magazine even ran an advertisement calling the Post the greatest show window in America, and Rockwell's art was right at its center. But fame came with its own kind of exhaustion. By the time he was 25, he had created 25 covers for the Post and dozens of other illustrations. The pressure was immense. Behind the cheerful smiles of his painted characters, Norman was battling anxiety and self-doubt. He once confessed, "All I had was the ability to draw, which, as far as I could see, didn't count for much." Yet those insecurities became the soul of his art. He painted people who felt awkward, uncertain, human. And in doing so, he made millions of Americans feel seen. In the summer of 1916, at the height of his early success, Norman married Irene O'Connor, a schoolteacher 3 years older than him. They had met briefly at a boarding house in New Rochelle, and though they barely knew each other, Norman proposed. But marriage did not come easily to him. Irene wanted stability and a quiet home life. Norman wanted to paint. His work consumed him, and he often disappeared into his studio for days, lost in his imagination. The distance between them grew wider with each passing year. They never had children, and Norman later admitted, with quiet sadness, "After we'd been married a while, I realized she didn't love me." Still, the marriage dragged on for 14 years before ending in divorce in 1930. Even as his personal life unraveled, Norman's fame continued to soar. Between 1916 and 1919, his Saturday Evening Post covers captured the spirit of wartime America, patriotism, innocence, and hope. Yet behind the cheerful scenes, Norman suffered from anxiety, disappearing for stretches of time when he felt he could no longer live up to expectations. By 1920, his art had evolved. His lines were sharper, his colors more refined. Critics began to see him not just as a commercial illustrator, but as a serious artist. Still, the pressure was relentless. He suffered a breakdown in his mid-20s, a period politely described as nervous exhaustion. During his recovery, he formed a close friendship with J.C. Leyendecker, the same artist he had once idolized. Their bond helped him find stability again. The 1920s brought prosperity and opportunity. Major brands like Jell-O and Coca-Cola sought his touch, the warmth, humor, and humanity that only he could capture. In 1923, he painted a Jell-O advertisement showing a smiling family gathered around a glowing kitchen table, the perfect image of happiness. It became his signature style, the idealized, heartwarming vision of American life that would define him for decades. He continued working for magazines like Country Gentleman, Literary Digest, Leslie's Weekly, and Judge, perfecting his craft. By 1929, however, cracks were forming again. That summer, he and Irene took separate vacations, he to Europe, she to her own quiet retreat. Norman wandered through museums in France, Austria, and Spain, studying the masters, trying to find inspiration. When he returned home, Irene confessed that she had fallen in love with someone else. Their marriage ended in Reno in early 1930. Heartbroken but restless, Norman traveled west to California, staying with Clyde Forsyth in Alhambra. There, amid the dry desert air, he painted The Doctor and the Doll, one of his most tender works, a small girl clutching her toy as a kindly doctor knelt before her. The painting captured everything he was: nostalgic, empathetic, searching. While in California, Forsyth introduced him to Mary Barstow, a young math teacher and aspiring writer, 14 years his junior. They married in her parents' garden on April 17, 1930. Together, they had 3 sons, Jarvis, Thomas, and Peter. Yet even with success, love, and family, the shadows never fully disappeared. By 1933, the strain of endless work, perfectionism, and public pressure drove him once again to the edge. He was hospitalized for what doctors called nervous exhaustion. Behind the warm glow of his paintings was a man constantly fighting for peace of mind, a man who, despite painting joy for the world, struggled to find it for himself. Millions of people saw Norman Rockwell's work every week, his paintings appearing in homes across America, in magazines, calendars, and advertisements. They smiled at his idyllic small-town scenes, the perfect families, the mischievous children, the quiet humor hidden in everyday moments. But behind that public image was a man grappling with profound inner turmoil, a painter whose life was far from the cheerful worlds he created. In the same year he embarked on a journey that would leave deep emotional scars. Norman convinced his wife Mary to accompany him and their infant son Jarvis, who was only 5 months old, on a trip to Europe. He hoped the city of light, of art and history, would reignite the passion that had begun to waver. Paris, with its cobbled streets, cafes, and the grandeur of its museums, promised inspiration. He studied the works of Rembrandt, Rubens, and other old masters, expecting to be uplifted, to feel the creative fire burn anew. Instead, he found himself spiraling. The grandeur and weight of history made his own work feel trivial, and the laughter and warmth he painted for millions now seemed hollow and meaningless. He called himself a fraud, believing his Saturday Evening Post covers, once the pinnacle of American illustration, were insignificant compared to the masterpieces housed in the museums. His thoughts darkened to the point of considering the unthinkable, the shadow of despair pressing close, leaving a deep and lasting scar that would haunt him long after he returned home. In 1935, a new professional opportunity appeared, tentative but promising. He was asked to create illustrations for Mark Twain's beloved novels, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Initially reluctant, he accepted, sensing both challenge and obligation. To capture the essence of Twain's world, Norman traveled to Hannibal, Missouri, immersing himself in the town where Twain had grown up. He photographed the streets, the river, the buildings, and the people, a method not yet common among serious painters. These images would later inform his illustrations, published in 1936 and 1940. Yet, even as he produced these works, unease lingered. Some drawings carried subtle racial stereotypes, a reflection of the period's biases. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in later decades, Norman would admit regret, recognizing that some portrayals had been insensitive, a blemish on his otherwise celebrated career. By 1938, seeking peace and stability, Norman and Mary purchased a 60-acre farmhouse in Arlington, Vermont. The pastoral landscape promised a respite from the pressures of New York and the magazine world, a chance for the family to thrive. For a time, it seemed idyllic. They attended square dances, participated in town meetings, and tried to embrace the rhythm of small-town life. Yet behind the smiles and routines, the fractures in their family grew. Mary's drinking worsened, and Norman recorded in his journal the distance and anger that seemed to radiate from her when intoxicated. Even the simplest pleasures, swimming in the river that meandered through their land, became tinged with anxiety. He claimed the water was too cold, but the truth lay deeper. A persistent, gnawing tension had lodged itself in his mind. In 1939, seeking understanding and relief, Norman began therapy with Erik Erikson, a psychoanalyst who had escaped Nazi Germany. Erikson helped him confront the patterns that had shaped his art and his life. Norman realized that many of the warm, cheerful paintings he produced were a form of self-healing, a means to reconstruct the childhood he had never truly had. His mother had been cold and distant, his formative years marked by a sense of alienation in New York. The families he painted, the children he captured in moments of joy or mischief, were the families he longed for, the connections he had missed. Therapy gave him insight, and with that insight came strength, a renewed ability to invest meaning into every stroke of his brush. In 1942, the world outside his Vermont sanctuary was at war, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt had articulated a vision of human freedoms that resonated deeply with Norman. He conceived 4 paintings inspired by Roosevelt's 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. When he pitched the concept to the Saturday Evening Post, editors hesitated, fearing it might unsettle readers. Norman's conviction was unwavering, and he chose to finance the project himself. Using neighbors as models, he poured months into the work, capturing every expression, every subtle gesture with painstaking care. The following year, in 1943, the 4 Freedoms paintings toured 16 cities, raising $132 million in war bonds, over $2 billion today, and was seen by more than 1.2 million people. Norman even attended in person to sign prints, connecting with the public in a way he rarely allowed himself. Yet not all responses were welcoming. The freedom of worship painting, showing people of different races and religions praying together, drew vitriol. Letters arrived accusing him of promoting racial mixing and communism. Some southern cities refused to display the works. Still, the tour was an undeniable success, a testament to the power of art to inspire and mobilize. The year also brought tragedy. In late 1943, Norman's studio, the sacred space where hundreds of paintings, props, costumes, and personal treasures lay, was consumed by fire. He lost items worth around $100,000 at the time, over $1.5 million today. Some neighbors speculated carelessly discarded pipe ashes had sparked the blaze, while Norman suspected foul play, recalling bitter disputes over property lines. Regardless of cause, the devastation was total. Yet the town rallied. Friends and neighbors brought him new pipes, small tokens of solidarity in the face of overwhelming loss. Amid the ruins, Norman continued to work, producing Rosie the Riveter for the Saturday Evening Post cover that same year. Rosie, modeled on 19-year-old telephone operator Mary Louise Doyle, symbolized strength and resolve, a young woman defying the limitations imposed on her sex, crushing Hitler's manifesto beneath her boot. Norman enlarged her figure beyond reality, imbuing her with monumental power, a choice that later left him with pangs of guilt. The public reaction was explosive. Some male readers canceled subscriptions in outrage, unable to accept women stepping into roles historically reserved for men. Yet Norman had reshaped the American image of heroism, even amid personal and professional chaos. Behind the public acclaim, his marriage with Mary continued to deteriorate. Her alcoholism and mental health struggles deepened during the 1940s and 1950s, requiring psychiatric care at the Austin Riggs Center, a 90-minute drive from their Vermont home. She endured treatments that included months of hospitalization and electroshock therapy. Norman felt increasingly isolated, his emotional support drawn from the quiet relationships he cultivated with the women he painted, connections that were subtle but crucial to his survival. In 1953, the family relocated to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, to place Mary near the treatment center. Norman himself began therapy, seeking ways to cope with the mounting pressures, the relentless deadlines, the public's expectations, and the private anguish of watching the woman he loved struggle. In 1946, Norman published his autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator, revealing insecurities and fears that belied the cheerful worlds he portrayed. He spoke of constant stress, perfectionism, and the terror of failure. Yet he omitted the darker truths. Many scholars and biographers have since suggested that he relied on amphetamines to maintain his grueling work pace, a hidden detail that belies the perfection and ease his works seem to convey. He painted joy and comfort while privately navigating a maelstrom of anxiety and depression. The 1950s brought further challenges. Mary's health declined, and Norman's obligations expanded. He undertook serial advertisements and magazine covers to cover her medical expenses, masking the tension and sorrow of their home behind the veneer of a picturesque New England town. Stockbridge appeared idyllic, but within its borders, fear, illness, and anxiety governed daily life. In 1953, familial tensions flared publicly. His son Peter spoke out, claiming Norman had been emotionally distant, a revelation that ignited scandal. Yet letters discovered decades later by Rockwell's grandson painted a fuller picture. Norman had tried to be present, to nurture his children, build mini studios, provide support, and share his passion for art, even as his obsession with perfection consumed hours, weeks, and sometimes months. One magazine cover took nearly a year to complete, forcing him to borrow money to sustain the painstaking revisions. Each stroke of the brush was an act of devotion, yet it exacted a cost, time and connection with those he loved most. In 1959, Mary died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving Norman shattered. His grief flowed into his work. Yet magazines rejected darker, more emotionally raw paintings, seeking only joy and light. His therapist, Eric Erickson, remarked, "You paint your happiness, but you don't live it," a truth that struck deep. Norman buried his sorrow to continue, but each act of suppression drained him further. In 1961, he remarried. His third wife, Molly Punderson, a retired teacher, was organized and calm. Norman was 6-7. She was 6-5. The marriage, built on practicality and companionship rather than romantic passion, provided him the stability he desperately needed. For the first time in decades, his life found balance. By 1963, after 4 to 7 years, Norman departed from the Saturday Evening Post. His last cover, a portrait of President John F. Kennedy following the assassination, marked the end of an era. He had painted 321 covers, but the world and his art were changing. The magazine would not allow him to portray Black Americans beyond the background or in subservient roles. Norman recognized the lie in his previous works, acknowledging, "I portrayed the best of all possible worlds. That kind of stuff is dead now." At 6-9, he sought to confront the truth. In 1964, joining Look magazine, he was granted freedom to depict the realities he felt compelled to show: civil rights, social injustice, and the often painful truths hidden behind America's facade. The backlash was immediate. Threatening letters poured in. Some called him a race traitor. Others warned of grave consequences should he continue. Even at 70, he pressed on. That year, he painted The Problem We All Live With, showing 6-year-old Ruby Bridges walking to school under the watch of U.S. Marshals, a wall behind her defaced with racial slurs and a splattered tomato. The image was stark, unflinching, and deeply uncomfortable for many viewers. Subscriptions were canceled. Outrage spread. Yet Norman persisted, determined to depict the America he believed should be seen, the truth that had long been suppressed. Throughout the 1960s, he sought to atone for the portrayals of Black Americans in subservient roles from earlier works. He engaged with civil rights leaders, listened to communities, and strove to represent Black Americans as fully human, as heroes of their own stories. When, later in 1964, 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered in Mississippi while registering Black voters, Norman was profoundly shaken. The Ku Klux Klan, aided by local law enforcement, had committed the atrocity, and the discovery of their bodies in a dam shocked the nation. He could not sleep. He had nightmares that replayed the violence. The experience fueled his painting Murder in Mississippi, an intense, haunting depiction of the final moments of the men, illuminated only by torchlight, the shadows of their killers cast across the scene. For 5 weeks, Norman worked on nothing else, pouring grief, horror, and outrage into every brushstroke. In 1967, even as age weighed on him, he continued to document the shifting social landscape. He painted children meeting for the first time in desegregated neighborhoods, quiet and tender moments filled with subtle emotion, testament to a world striving, slowly, toward change. Yet life retained its unpredictability. In 1978, 7 of Rockwell's paintings were stolen from a Minnesota gallery, marking the state's largest art theft. 1. Taking a break from 1919, resurfaced decades later in a New Jersey home, purchased long ago for mere dollars after accidental damage during a game of pool. Norman's personal life remained a landscape of hidden complexities. In 2013, biographer Deborah Solomon published findings suggesting Rockwell had kept erotic drawings and potentially repressed desires, some directed toward men. Diary entries and notes hinted at deep, private fascinations, yet interpretations remained disputed. Even his own granddaughter challenged these claims, asserting they were misleading or unfair. The man behind the brush was enigmatic, and questions lingered long after his death. On January 10, 1977, President Gerald Ford awarded Norman the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Too ill to attend, his son Jarvis accepted the honor on his behalf. At 83, Norman reflected privately on a lifetime of compromises and achievements, wondering if he had sacrificed deeper artistic ambitions for commercial success. He passed away on November 8, 1978, at age 84. After his death, it emerged that he had nearly $50,000 in unpaid therapy bills, around $200,000 today, a quiet testament to a life lived in the shadow of anxiety and depression, even while painting the face of happiness for a nation. Then, in 2004, a remarkable discovery revealed another chapter. Behind a false wall in illustrator Donald Tractor's home, Norman's original Breaking Home Ties, one of his most famous works, was found. A copy had been displayed while the original was hidden, likely due to a bitter divorce. When auctioned in 2006, it sold for $15.4 million. The revelation stirred questions. How many other originals might remain hidden, quietly tucked away, waiting to be rediscovered? Norman Rockwell, the painter of American dreams, had lived a life as layered and complex as any canvas he ever touched, a man whose private struggles, once invisible, now tell a story as compelling as the art itself.